My name is Norman Wirzba, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar series entitled Facing the Anthropocene. In case you are unfamiliar with the term, the Anthropocene marks the unprecedented moment when some humans became a dominant force in planetary history, responsible for the widespread alteration of the world's land, ocean, atmospheric, and life systems. Though planetary systems and biological processes are still clearly at work, their expressions and effects can no longer be understood apart from human activity. Ranging from the cellular to the atmospheric levels, there is no place or process on Earth that does not reflect humanity's technological prowess and its economic reach. The advent of the Anthropocene, in other words, compels a rethinking of multiple fundamental questions like, what sort of human being is the human being that now exerts this outsized power? To what end should this power be directed? And how can we determine when power becomes irresponsible? How should we think about the world? Is anything sacred? How should we think about building a world together? And what are the economic, political, and legal mechanisms we will need to get there? How should we think about hope? It is unlikely that the frames of thought that brought us to this moment are sufficient to help us imagine and implement a better future, which is why now is the time to commit to rigorous probing and questioning of the assumptions and the commitments that have and continue to inspire our collective life. And we invite you as webinar participants to join in that process. We will have opportunity towards the end of this webinar to ask questions of our guest. So please look to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and submit your questions there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's guest. Willie James Jennings was for many years a faculty member and academic dean at Duke Divinity School, where he welcomed me many years ago. He is now Associate Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale University Divinity School. He's the author of several books. The first, The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race, won multiple awards, including the prestigious Grawemeyer Award in 2015. Since then, he has also published a commentary on Acts, and most recently, his book, After Whiteness, An Education in Belonging, aims to redescribe and reorient theological education, but also the education project more broadly. He is currently working on a book called Unfolding the World, Recasting a Christian Doctrine of Creation, a book that I am quite eager to see completed. So Willie, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Norman. I am so glad to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this since this was set up. So let me talk a little bit about my work, and then I look forward to our conversation together. What is the relationship between race and place? This has been one of the driving concerns of my work as a Christian theologian. In my work, I have been tracing out the links between the modern racial condition and the modern geographic condition, as Norman was starting to outline in his comments. They formed together. Another way to say this is that the development of race and the development of modern private property are two sides of the same coin. Both represent forms of abiding enclosure that we have naturalized and normalized. I am convinced that we cannot address the global problem of white supremacy and the racial antagonism that is structured into the modern Western world, nor the crises of the Anthropocene, until we understand and address this relationship. What so many people are yet to understand is that this relationship formed inside a Christian architecture. There is a Christian architecture to modern racial reasoning, and there is a racial architecture to modern Christianity. Beyond Christianity, this architecture has a profound influence on how we understand body and land. Take, for example, the idea of possession as it has come to exist for so many of us on this planet. The idea of possession is an ancient idea, as ancient as is social life for plants, animals, and humans. But from the beginning of the modern colonial period, in the 15th century on, this idea of possession began to shift in Christian thought because it was shifting in Christian practice. What William Cronin said in his classic text, Changes in the Land, about the Native Americans of New England in the beginning of the 17th century, could be said about indigenous peoples much earlier in encounter with Proto-European colonialists. They found themselves surrounded by people who had a strange new way of thinking possession. These invading European Christians saw possession through break, separation, and enclosure. Break, separation, enclosure, where native groups saw possession through continuum, connection, overlap. The former, a possession of; the latter, a possession by. The former made a claim on something. The latter was claimed by something. Now, this is no small difference, because between these two ways of imagining possession, one world is being destroyed and another world is being created. The indigenous world being destroyed articulated claims to things inside the logic of a commons, but not a commons in the sense of early Europeans to the New Worlds, who imagined the commons as small islands of shared land in a sea of feudal holdings. The indigenous commons is everywhere, and each people may have claim to this or that place to hunt or gather food or celebrate or deliberate or listen to the ancestors and or the animal kin. This common touches tools for use and a logic of sharing, and it touches bodies in shared concern. It also involves a kind of reciprocity with animals, plants, and seasons, each requiring attentiveness and respect. Now, it does not preclude violence or theft or dispute over lands or even oppression. It narrates such horrors, however, when narrations are given through violations of the commons and attacks on communal or even covenantal bonds. The world being created by the colonialist articulated claims to things inside the logic of control. Now, most historians of these periods and decolonial theorists see this as a logic of commerce. They are correct, but short-sighted, because commerce follows control, and control has to do with making my world manageable, understandable, and containable. These are the terms through which to see the long deployment of European pastoral practices and agricultural sensibilities in the New Worlds. It was those practices and sensibilities that shaped their aggressive reformatting of the landscapes of the New World and determined their assessment of native life. The colonial settlers reached two ominous conclusions about native life in the land. First, native peoples did not know how to cultivate specific lands to make them productive. That is, they did not know how to properly farm or build habitation. And secondly, they should be seen in possession of only those lands that were being cultivated and improved. The cultivation and improvement of the land reached all the way to the body, as indigenous peoples the world over were being forced to live inside constraining visions of ownership. You own only what you cultivate. Both slaves and indigenous peoples came to understand under modern colonialist regimes that possession connected body and land, operationalizing one's right to exist and one's freedom. To claim oneself was to possess oneself. To claim oneself was to possess oneself. And to claim your existence as a people required you lay claim to some piece of land as the space for your cultivation and productivity. Through this vision of possession, ownership and existence were coupled together and made a crucial foundational aspect of self-determination and self-expression. So possession of land and possession of ourselves formed in modernity as two sides of the same coin. This vision of possession shaped the ways we understand productivity and use and value and voice and even human worth. We are all caught up in performances of self-possession that build directly out of this colonialist logic. So how might we turn the performance of self-possession against itself and toward a life of the commons, of shared reciprocal life? How might we think beyond the category of ownership as we think about life together and build habitation? Well, these are the kinds of questions that occupy my time. And I know it is not time wasted. So Norman, I look forward to talking with you now about my work and your work and the challenge of the Anthropocene.
So there's so much that you're talking about here that we're going to try to unpack some of. We're not going to get to all of it. But again, just a reminder to webinar participants that you will have opportunity to ask questions. So please put those in the Q&A tab. So firstly, the point that you're making about the role that possession plays, I want you to explore a little bit how this idea works itself out in a couple of different registers. On the one, there's certainly the economic register that we can talk about. And you use the word covenant, but so much of modern economy prefers the language of contract. So covenantal and contractual ways of sort of parsing out the world and figuring out how human beings are going to relate to each other, to other creatures, to their places, now come to be defined in contractual terms. So can you say a little bit about how you see the difference and why you might speculate about the preference for contractual ways of framing an imagination versus the covenantal ways that you think are so much more important for us to recover?
Absolutely. So, what is required to have a robust sense of covenant is that you have to have a robust sense of a living world, an animate and communicative world. And in that regard, a reciprocal reality that shapes your life. But if you have a vision, say, like the great John Locke, if you have a vision like Locke, then that's not the way you approach it. You approach the world as though it is an object. It is a thing. It is a resource. Let's use the word that Locke used that we all inherited. It is nature. Mm-hmm. And what nature is fundamentally just matter. We can even call it, like some people would call it today, vibrant matter, but it's just matter. And so it is there, ready to be cultivated, brought from potentiality to actuality, brought to its full use. And so the question is, how do we divvy up, as it were, what we're going to do with each of our hands, our sets of hands, with this stuff? So in that kind of relationship, not only with the world, but with each other, contract makes a lot of sense, because contract basically says that we're now inside of a process of shared management, shared control over what we can possess, beginning with our bodies, reaching to the land. In fact, Locke's logic was brilliant in this regard. He said, let's start with the first possession. The first possession is yourself that God has given you. And God has given you responsibility to cultivate yourself. Then, in order to live in this shared reality of a world, God has given you the right to touch your piece of it and cultivate that. And if you are able to cultivate it, guess what? It's yours. Now, covenant is something very different, because covenant requires that you think out of the possibility that the world speaks to you, that the world interacts with you, and that the way you treat it is fundamental to the way you address the world. And here, this is crucial, because for those who are inside the Abrahamic traditions, and those of us who are Christian, we understand that this is precisely the way in which God wants us to understand all of creation, not as something that is a thing for us to hold, but a reality of reciprocity, of relationship.
Yeah.
So that the way in which we will move forward in the world, with the world and with one another, is covenant. I am doing things in response to your living reality, and you are doing things in response to mine. And so our relationship is built on that. So if in fact there is violation of that relationship, what covenant says, first of all, is that because we are living together, there are ways to work through that violation. Now, of course, there's some of that with contract, but we understand it's a very different way of imagining reciprocity and listening.
So you speak about other creatures, places speaking. You used a word earlier in your remarks about how the world ceases to have a claim on us. And I think the language of claim is so important, because it's fundamentally, I think, a theological supposition here, because Locke's description of the world as nature means that nothing can signify as the material embodiment or expression of God's love, right? None of it's morally charged in that sort of way. It's just object. And the whole project of objectification, you might say, is this project to try to lessen the moral claim that anything has on us.
Well, I think that's exactly right, because what's at stake is the way in which one frames creativity and productivity, right? If it is an object to be worked upon, it is like a canvas. If it's an object to be imagined upon, it is terra nullis. It is a nothing that has to be made into something.
The tabula rasa.
Right. And so what that means is that I can, in that regard, I can see my obligations. I can envision my moral responsibility to be fully captured by productivity and creativity, right? That the person who is not productive is the immoral person. The person who does not bring their creativity, that has not had their labor finely aligned to producing. That's what we talk about on morality.
Yeah.
And for so many people in the West, this is precisely the case, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That productivity becomes the fundamental vehicle by which one calibrates what it means to be moral.
Yeah. And that productivity depends upon conception of things as commodities, right? The things that are made are units of production, and the people who purchase these things are simply units of consumption. And so the idea that any of this could manifest or witness to what we might call a sacred conception of life seems to have disappeared.
Well, and you don't really need it. I mean, this ties into your point about objectivity. Ties in as so many what I call the anthropological philosophers these days who are writing about these matters say that within a kind of naturalist vision, a vision of naturalism, as DeCola talks about, vision of naturalism, then what you wind up having is a world that to extract from it becomes the primary form of relationality.
Mm.
Everything is about extraction. And so extraction becomes the inner logic of consumption.
Mm.
Extraction becomes the inner logic of, again, productivity. Because what we're doing is we're taking from the world the resources that are inside of it, kind of hidden inside of it, and thus opening it up to its true possibilities. And for so many people, that way of imagining the world is also the way they imagine themselves, right? That, I have to pull out of myself the true possibilities of what I could become. And that becoming is then aligned beautifully with extraction, so that I can't imagine my becoming. I can't imagine whatever I want to become without also imagining that I've got to extract.
Right. Got to own and control. Yeah. So let's take it now to the second register, from economy to the question of freedom, right? Freedom circulates through so much of your texts. You're very concerned about how we frame freedom, how we think about it, what we think we're doing when we are acting as free persons. Can you say a little bit about how the covenantal sensibility that you've started to unpack for us today maybe shifts the way we think about freedom? Because there's this a modern project of freedom, which is the autonomous, even autarkic, self-standing, self-driven individual, pretty much on a path to loneliness. And you're wanting to give us a description of freedom that really pushes against this notion of self-possession, self-determination, self-origination. Can you talk a little bit how
Yeah.
your thinking about freedom has changed as a result of your thinking about human habitation in the world in the last several centuries?
Yeah, this is the crucial matter for us, because we have all been bequeathed this legacy, especially as the reality in the aftermath of colonialism. So the colonial moment created for the world over a fundamental choice inside a terrible question. Either you own it or I will own it.
Mm-hmm.
Either you possess it or I will possess it. And given those choices, the only choice is to say, I possess it. Now, here is the problem for us, Norman, right? The problem is that becomes the inner logic of freedom. That becomes the inner logic of self-expression.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes the inner logic of the performance of ownership and of possession. The caught inside that crucial model, either you own it or I will. Either you take the reins or I will. And so what does it mean to have freedom shaped inside possession?
Mm.
Right? Have freedom shaped inside possession. Now, covenant imagines possession framed inside the freedom for, the freedom with. I mean, this is what covenant is about. Covenant is about freely entering into relationship that will continue and is sustained by the freedom for one another. I choose you. You choose me. Now, theologically, those of us inside the Abrahamic tradition, those of us inside Christianity, we know what's at the heart of that is God has said, I have chosen you and I invite you inside that choice, a choice that will never go away, a choice that you don't sustain by your power. I sustain it, God says. I invite you into that covenant of choosing me because I have chosen you and I will not stop choosing you.
Yeah.
Should you not choose me? But now that reality in many ways, and this is the irony of it, right? It was Christianity, colonial Christianity moving forward, that pushed that reality to the side and placed freedom inside possession. And so what that means for us is that for so many people, that we are pressed toward there are two modalities in which this is working. The modality of the nation, nationalism, and the modality of the individual, individualism. And in those two modalities, most of us have had our imaginations completely policed in terms of freedom. It's freedom at the reality of the nation, freedom at the reality of the individual. And we imagine freedom caught between those two modalities. And the problem is that those two modalities are themselves caught inside this larger reality of possession. So
That's
what that
powerful.
means is that forms of self-expression are in many ways an illusion aiming at a freedom. It's an illusion of freedom aiming at freedom. The reality of the nation is an illusion of freedom aiming at a freedom. But of course, in the reality of the Western condition, there's a price for both those tickets, and you're starting to name it. The reality of being caught in constant consumption, whether we want to get out of it or not. The reality of being caught in nationalist vision, whether we want it or not. And we can take so many different things that are just profound signatures of that captivity. Take, for example, the creation of weapons. Take, for another example, the ongoing reality of trash. I mean, these things show what it means to be caught in a freedom based on the individual. You produce trash, and a freedom tied to the nation. You need weapons, and you need to constantly keep buying weapons in order to ensure your freedom.
Yeah. A term that's become really important that really surfaces powerfully in After Whiteness is the word belonging. And you talked about how belonging is really the basis for any way we might talk about what it is to be an individual person.
Yeah.
So it's not that you're opposed to individuality of any kind, but that the framing of it that starts from separation or alienation or fear or anxiety is vastly different than an expression of the person, individual person even, when it happens in the space of community. And I want to, since you're an ordained Baptist preacher, we have to bring in the Bible. In Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he says, where the Holy Spirit is, there is freedom. Can you talk a little bit about the Holy Spirit, belonging, and becoming a person? How do you see those three coming together in powerful ways in your work?
Absolutely. I mean, and in After Whiteness, I'm trying to reposition something that has been banished from the idea of formation. In the context of that book, it's formation within the modern educational systems of the West. But the larger reality of formation is the formation into what it means to be fully human, right? And what has been banished is belonging. And so what we have been presented is an idea of belonging as something that is further down the road after you have fully actualized yourself as an individual. When in point of fact, that actualization requires, in a fundamental way, belonging. Now, what we mean by belonging has to be worked out very clearly. So belonging doesn't mean that, okay, I'm a part of a family, part of a community, part of a tribe, part of an ethnic group. No, belonging as an active way of understanding how I cultivate reciprocity, conversation, community. The word I'm using to capture a lot of this is communion. How I start to perform a rich sense of dwelling with. Now, what's crucial about that is that for those of us inside, especially inside the Christian tradition, we know that the work of the Spirit is precisely to orient us toward that as the context of our growth, as the context of our, what growth? All growth, not just some very narrow idea of spiritual growth, but intellectual growth, growth as a human being, growth as a person, growth as a moral agent. All of that is centered inside the opening up, the performing outward of a reality of belonging, of connectivity, of drawing people, listening to people, creating by our very presence, the desire of people to know each other who would not want to know each other. This is what the Spirit is positioning us, those of us who follow the life of Jesus, who follow Jesus. Why? Because this is what Jesus was about, the crowds he drew. And so there's something incredibly important about trying to position belonging not as that which is opposed to the glory of the individual and the individual's voice, but to, in a sense, to overcome what has been a terrible illusion. I mean, any great singer, any great artist knows this, that the greater an artist is, the more you see an entire community in that person's work. That the reality of belonging has not eclipsed the beauty of the singular voice. It has actually made it what it is, right? So that, so when you hear the great Aretha Franklin, you hear not just Aretha, you hear an entire reality of Black singers. You hear an entire reality of the Black community. You hear men and women going back way before her and who will follow in her footsteps for generations. But you hear also the singular talent of Aretha. Now, that reality eludes so many people as they think about their own individual quest for self-actualization. And I would say, Norman, to be fair, for so many people, they are given this bill of goods inside of their educational process. They're given a vision of self-actualization that is primarily tied to what we were talking about earlier: self-possession and possession. Self-possession as the means to possessing what you want in the world. And so our educational systems, as they are now set up, angle people toward the illusion of a form of self-actualization that banishes belonging as a crucial, centered reality to becoming who you want to become.
Yeah. What I find about your work, which is so important, especially for our own time, is that you want to extend the discussion about belonging, not simply to intrahuman relations, but you're talking about belonging to the land, right? And we both are fans of Robin Kimmerer, and
Yes.
Bell Hooks has written about this also,
Yes.
about how
Yes.
people being alienated, divorced, cut off from the
Yes.
land does profound psychic damage.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit about how it is you're thinking about our places, our specific lands, watersheds, farming lands, all of these sort of very particular ecological realities, how you're thinking about our belonging to them and its claims upon us, because it's difficult, right? I mean, if you grow food, being claimed by a garden is not always a happy experience. So how do you talk about this belonging? And then we'll come also to the question, which we'll save for now, but why is it that you think in theology in particular, place has been mostly way to the side, hardly taken up?
Well, Lauren, and so much of this, as you know, I have learned so much from your wonderful work on these matters. But look, I grew up with gardeners, Black folks from the South. And here's the thing that most people don't fully appreciate about gardening culture, especially Black gardening culture from folks coming from the South. But it's true all over the planet. I mean, so these two elements I'm about to talk about are crucial. So what it means to be tied to the land and have a sense of belonging that comes of the land is precisely the living out of that right relationship. That is, it is not possession of first, it is possession by first. And possession by then allows one to say quite tentatively, possession of. But you first say possession by. And what does possession by mean? Well, let me talk about my family for just a moment so we can see how this belonging works out. So let's talk about this using the rubrics you used earlier. First, talk about the economic. So I'm the youngest of 11 born to my parents. 8 or 9 of us in the house at most of the time growing up. My dad had a good job, but you can't feed nine people and cousins and everybody else with that. My mother had a twin who also had a large family. And so, and this is how most Black people moving from the South to the North survived in the strange, cold world of the North. In the summer times, they took that little plot of land behind their house or to the side of their house, and with that little piece of fence, and they had a garden, right? And where I grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with a wonderful, rich, dark Michigan dirt, man. So the if you went into the backyard, you would look down the whole street through the back, and what you would see going all the way to almost to the end of the street, you would see these gardens in the back, right? With little fences separating them, folks leaning over the fence talking. But so what do we do? So I had a little Stingray bike. I used to ride my bike all through the neighborhoods. But my mother always often called me, come here, Willie, come into the kitchen. Take this corn down to Sister Slater. She has some peas for me. And then go over to Mother Red, because she has some beans that she's got for me. And you take this bread that I got. Mr. Johnson got some eggs from his chicken. Back when they allowed you to have a chicken. And get them eggs and bread. So what does that mean? We had this beautiful informal economy in which there was beautiful exchange going on. Exchange that economists have not yet even figured out to this moment. This exchange going on all about us, and this is how we got fed. And then as the season started to turn, it was time for canning. It was time for preserving. And so all kinds of things were canned and preserved, put into the basement, cold area of the basement. And so throughout the winter, you ate fresh vegetables. Throughout the winter, you ate good food. My mother, when this was the Walmart before Walmart, there was a place called Myers. And my mother would go to Myers once a month. And it was seen as a sign of failure. If you had to go more than that, I mean, you don't, I'm not gonna go, I ain't gonna buy them carrots. Why should I buy them carrots? I grow my own carrots. So that's the first reality. That's that economic reality of surviving. And the belonging that is a part of, that the land gives you life. Even as you're surrounded by people who want your death, the land gives you life. But then there's the other part of it. And the other part of it is the touching of the soil, the sitting and being with plant, and there out in the cool of the evening, rehearsing that moment from the Garden of Eden. What am I talking about? So mom and dad, they work hard. At the end of the day, where are you going to find them, especially in the summer months? You're going to find them not in the house. We have a little shotgun house. You're not going to find them in the house. You're going to find them sitting in those wonderful cast iron chairs out in their garden, sitting in the grass, talking, close enough to the neighbors who are also sitting in the grass near their garden, talking, and close enough to other neighbors who can shout across their fence, sitting on the back, laughing, talking. Where are the events going to happen? The birthday parties, the fun and games out in the backyard. Now, that's not simply about a kind of social logic. That's a therapeutic intervention. That's a recalibrating of who I am by touching the dirt.
Mm.
My mother every spring would make me stick my hands in the dirt. And I used to say, why am I sticking my hands in this dirt? Later on, she helped me to understand this is helping you remember not only who you are, but to whom you belong.
Mm.
God created this dirt. Stick your hand in it. See, these are the matters that have escaped us, right? And I've learned this from so many indigenous writers that the land as possession, thinking the land as possession, is a narrowing, in many ways, a grotesque inversion of the deep reality of the land. But for so many people, they have been cut off from both those senses, haven't they? They have no idea how food is grown. They have no sense of the whole process. And they have no sense of why their bodies need to touch the earth. I mean, if there's anything this pandemic has started to bring home to a number of people, is not just that they need to get outside, but something happens if they don't get outside and touch the earth. Something is happening to them. And at the moments in which they feel like they're about to lose their mind, some people are seeing this for the first time simply by going outside, standing next to this tree, listening to this bird, watching this deer move, watching the squirrel look at you like, what, what's going on? All of this is, to use the words of Edward Kahn, there's a semiosis, there's a semiotic reality to the world in which the world brings to us a fundamental sense of ourselves.
Mm.
And that's a theological point. That's also a medical point. That's also an economic point. But it's also a moral point, Norman, isn't it? Because to create habitation, to create built environments that deny both those realities is immoral,
Mm.
fundamentally immoral. Right?
Yeah.
It's not a question of, it's not aesthetically pleasing, isn't that as well? But there's something fundamentally immoral in creating habitation, creating built environments in which those two realities I just named are constantly thwarted.
Mm.
And we're constantly told that they are not the way to live.
So I want to take this now into a musical register. You mentioned Aretha Franklin. I said I want to talk to you a little bit about jazz, and you talking about gardens makes me wonder if your love for jazz grew up in the garden, watching these people do a kind of improvisational listening,
Oh, yeah.
responsive dance to the needs of plants, to the needs or the formations of weather patterns. I mean, it's just to be a gardener is to
Yeah.
constantly having to be moving, adjusting, listening. And it's not that it can be difficult, right? To have to be adjusting all the time to realities beyond your control. But jazz and improvisation, we might say, represents a kind of ability to be responsive in ways that are not debilitating, but creative, that open up a kind of space. So, I mean, do you talk about jazz in the Anthropocene at all, or the
Oh,
jazz
listen,
in the
I think
context?
I do. I do think there's a direct line, and I think there's a direct line in a number of ways. So, as listening to you ask that question, I was thinking about my mother. She learned the songs of the field that were in the mouth of her mother and her mother and her mother's mother. She learned those songs of the field, and those songs of the field, obviously the way it's been popularized, well, they were codes for, helping people escape. Yes, that's true. That's very true. They were also ways of making sense of the chaotic reality of slavery and oppression. My mother was a sharecropper, and sharecropping life is horrible life. And so she learned the songs of the field, and those songs of the field were the songs of the church. And those songs of the field that were the songs of the church were the womb of all the other music that grew, that became not only Black diaspora music, but American music, blues, jazz, all of gospel, rock, all of it comes out of that direct lineage. And so, and all of that are ways of dancing in the chaos. All of that are ways of making pain productive, as I like to say. The blues is the quintessential way to make pain productive, never to justify it, never to honor it, but to always make it productive, make it do something, make it do something. And that's what the blues is. And so what rock took was a productive conjuring of living with pain. What jazz took was that productive conjuring of a way to deal with pain and the self-expression of it, that moving through the chaos inside the work of self-expression. All of that is so tied together so beautifully. But what's also the case is that so much of artistic expression is caught beautifully between really these two challenges. On the one, or should I say this challenge on the one side of being pulled back into the modalities of self-possession and commodification and all that follows, or being seen as a way of carving a way through the chaos, of making pain productive, of grasping toward life, of striving toward life. And and those two challenges are constantly there for every artist.
Yeah.
How to be able to do your art in a way that the commodifications of everything don't overwhelm your art.
Yeah.
And how to do your art in ways that deepen.
Yeah. So the painter Cezanne says at one point that he did not want to represent the world, but through his art have the world give expression to itself in its movement. And that's also just a beautiful way, I think, of articulating some of what you're saying. Right? It's not that you're trying to honor or justify the pain, but you're trying to let the pain come to the surface in ways for people to see and engage in some pretty powerful ways. I want to get now to some of the questions from our participants. So one is, what tangible practices can change our lived realities so that we move away from the logics of possession and control? What kinds of things do you recommend?
One of the things that has to happen is we have to become better storytellers of the places that we inhabit. One of the things that's happening now that I'm very pleased about is that, and I know it's happening there as well, that at many institutions, one of the first things that people are now saying at any event is that we are on the unceded lands, and then they'll name one or several indigenous groups. I think that's wonderful. The problem is that it's becoming my worry is it becomes a ritual without any substance. Yeah. And that is to say, there needs to be a pedagogical constellation of practices around that statement. So what does it mean to have an institution now gear its education around the fact that is on the unceded lands of these peoples? And what does it mean for the educational programs across whatever it is, a college or a university or a divinity school or seminary, inside that fact? Or what it first should mean is learning that history, right? Coming deep inside that history. And in that regard, already starting to loosen up the idea of possession, right? Open up that idea that you really are in a place, that you are on a place, with a place in which any protocols of reciprocity, any processes of respect have not yet taken hold in such a way that you are in continuity with those peoples who were there before you got there.
Yeah.
So that's the first crucial step. That's the first crucial step.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about the resistance that a lot of people have put up to something like the 1619 Project. Right? You mentioned the history, how important that is. Do you think this sort of historical work, like the 1619 Project, can play a role in maybe showing or problematizing how these logics of possession have taken hold? And then what do you do with the people who simply resist this whole effort to give a more truthful telling of the founding of, America, but then also institutions like Yale or Duke or other places?
You have to discern what's at stake. What's at stake in how we move forward as in our living as an institution and individuals, in the knowing, in the remembering, and then in the thinking through the details. But you also have to figure out what's at stake in the resistance and get people to articulate what is at stake in the resistance. Because often what's at stake in the resistance is either a fear. I mean, this is part of, we know that the reality of white grievance as it's being articulated by so many. There's a fear that somehow the quality of life, the project of life for them will now be attenuated, will now be cut off in some way if this focus becomes too important. We will get trapped in ways that what I'm aiming at and what we're aiming at for our life will somehow not be able to come to fruition. So we have to see what's at stake. Now, for those of us people of faith, we have a kind of higher calling in all this, right? We are told to remember. Mm-hmm. Remembering is a fundamental practice for Christians. So we have no choice. And so for Christians to resist the remembering, that really is a kind of fundamental failure of their faith. Mm-hmm. We don't have any choice in the matter. Remembering is part of the lifeblood of the Christian.
Yeah. So another question, this one is about the matter of covenant and the way we were speaking about covenant earlier. And I guess the question here is, as we're talking about reciprocity and mutuality within covenantal sensibilities, is there room for hierarchy in any of this? Or is hierarchy always going to be the problem?
Well, there's a couple of ways to think about this. And hierarchy is a fundamental problem. But now, if we mean by maybe not by hierarchy, but if we mean in our idea with the idea of reciprocity, that some can be spoken at first and then others need to listen, some need to speak and others need to be quiet, we can talk about that, and that's what we want. But what we don't want is the kind of hierarchy that imagines the silencing of some as a perpetual reality while the others speak. That form of hierarchy, which, as you and I both know, continues to be a major problem across the planet. I mean, I think of the work of Vandana Shiva. I mean, if there's anyone who has shown so powerfully in her work the problem of hierarchy when it comes to multinational, big agribusiness in relationship to the pastoral practices of local women around the world, that's the most stark reality of hierarchy, and patriarchy, and racism that we could probably name.
Yeah. So now here's a question about that relates specifically, I think, to your book, The Christian Imagination, where you showed how theology plays a central role in the formation of a racial imagination, but also the possessive logics that you've been describing in our conversation today. If theology has been at the heart of this evil construction, how can theology play a role in its transformation, right? Or another way to put this maybe is, has the imagination of Christianity, loaded term there, has that become so diseased that the resources for us to be able to think a better theological vision moving forward have just been undermined?
Norman, this is a serious question for so many people. And given what's going on, especially in this country, we are in a serious crisis of Christianity in the West. The jury is still out for a number of people whether Christianity is redeemable. And as someone who is a theologian, I understand that crisis. I'm sitting there waiting for the jury to come back in because this is a serious matter for us. We are inside of a set of Christian practices born of colonialism that have not abated, that have not run their course. They are still very active. However, I do believe that Christianity has an antidote to the problem that it helped to create. And that antidote is a form of life shunned from the very beginning, that is within Christianity, a form of life that builds on the things we've been talking about: reciprocity, a communicative, animate world that we live, as I say, in reciprocity with, a reality of the commons and of sharing and of life together that should become the deepest logic of the way we think, live, and build life. All of this, I think, is an anecdote to some of the messes that we have to create. It began in Christianity, but obviously it has spread far beyond Christianity. And so, Christianity helped to birth the problems we talked earlier about, individualism and nationalism. But Christianity can be incredibly helpful in overcoming both of those problems. And unfortunately, for so many people who are trying to, in a sense, think out of the problems of Christianity without Christianity, are pressing even more further into the very problematic structure that Christianity helped to create. And so a Christianity can come alongside all those efforts and say, well, let's, with the resources that were shunned by the colonialists and their children and their grandchildren, with those very resources, we can overcome what are these problems, because nationalism and individualism are problems created by problems. And so we can overcome them and overcome the kind of economic system that lives between them,
Yeah.
through a new vision, a more, as I say, a more organic vision of the faith.
Yeah, and here your own work, which has been in conversation with people outside Christianity, indigenous voices in particular, but others as well, can be so very, very important in fostering this kind of mutually correcting kind of vision that we need to be thinking about moving forward. We have just very brief minute or two. I want you just to answer quickly. You say that theologians have not engaged the built environment. What would happen in our built environments if you think theologians came to the work of building a better world for each other? What kinds of specific things would you say would be manifestations of this transformed imagination for the flourishing of all life?
Well, there'll be fundamental changes, I think, in the way theologians and all those involved with Christianity approach their life. I mean, for so many of us, the way we think of church is tragic in its isolation from the very environments that church exists. The way we think about habitation is tragically disconnected from any kind of ethical or moral compass. The way we think about life in the world in terms of property and property ownership is unbelievably grotesquely disconnected from our deepest theological commitments. And so I think what would happen is that people have to start to connect the dots in terms of thinking about a faith that is not just inside the logics of enclosure, my body, how am I doing with my body? But what am I doing in this neighborhood? What does this neighborhood mean for my very existence? What does this part of town mean? How are the structures of advantage and disadvantage being woven around me on the very ground in the way the neighborhood is shaped? And this becomes not simply a matter for the emerging young activists in the community, but for ethicists and theologians and all those who are trying to think the faith. And that's what's crucial at this moment. And my hope is to continue to try to gather together the people who can help us think more holistically and systematically about all of the built environment.
Wow. Unfortunately, we have to draw this to a close. We could keep going. This has been really, really great fun. So first of all, Willie, thank you so much for your time and for your wisdom. It's been a real pleasure to be with you today. And thank you to all of our webinar participants. Just to let you know that next week, we will be joined by Joyce Chaplin, who is a historian at Harvard University, and we look forward to that time. So again, thank you, Willie, and best wishes to all of you for a fine, fine day.